All right, so the first topic we are going to address today is quite a big one, and it's who are the winners and losers in the UFC's recent class action lawsuit that just recently settled. Now, obviously, before we get into this one, first of all, I just want to say it's obviously been quite massive, and it really was massive in terms of the overall MMA landscape. This is quite a complicated topic, but one that I consider to be extremely important. More so than most seem to realize, I think. And I think it's going to require a little bit of depth to properly unpack. Now, not too much or not too deeply, because we don't want to be here all day.
It's Professor Francis time. Professor Francis.
This is going to be another episode of Frankie Rants.
Frankie Rants.
Get the pillows ready. But also, I will say this, if you do want like a more comprehensive take on it, I would check out MMA on Points channel. Tommy Toho did like a really comprehensive cover of this that was really good. It was one of the sources I got my information from as well, and something I've been following for about a year. So yeah, apologies in advance for fucking boring the pants off of most of you who are watching this now, but I feel like a little bit of context is important. So this is something that you and I in particular have been following with, I think, some interest for some time.
Yeah.
And obviously we recently learned that the class action lawsuit that was filed against the UFC by former fighters, I believe it was numbering about, I think it was like 1,200 fighters, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Not sure if that's right.
I believe so.
Yeah, and the settlement, I think, was for about, I think it was $330 to $335 million. Now, on the surface, for most people that will come across the story, with the figure involved, it appears to be a massive win for the fighters that were involved, and is probably viewed as a massive blow for the UFC. It's an admission of guilt, and it looks like a healthy looking payout for the past transgressions that were put against former fighters. However, as we know, having looked into it a little bit deeper, it is a bit more nuanced than it appears on the surface. So before I ask you directly who you feel has won or lost with this coming to a conclusion, I just think we need a tiny little bit of context and just to understand what the lawsuit was about. So basically, in a nutshell, former fighters in the UFC were essentially suing the UFC in an antitrust lawsuit for what they were arguing were basically uncompetitive practices. So the argument put to was simply that the UFC was paying fighters unfairly and unproportionately based on revenue produced or, money made. And more importantly, through these restrictive contracts, they were basically tying down the best fighters in the world and, essentially giving competitors no chance to acquire talent and to essentially compete in that environment. So basically they were being paid a pittance of what they should have been, and then they were unable to go to competitors for a better deal due to the restrictive nature of these contracts. So now the lawsuit against the UFC wasn't just about money, and I think this is the misconception that a lot of people have. It was also about calling for changes in practices that would prevent the UFC from being able to continue to structure these contracts the same way moving forward with current fighters. So namely, more freedom over their careers, more comprehensive packages like medical, etc. So the fact that this has been settled for money only, as is being reported, is a pretty massive thing. So with this context laid out directly, I guess I want to know what your opinion is on this drawing to a conclusion is. So who do you think won? Who do you think lost? And what do you think the implications are going to be for this moving forward?
Well, easily the UFC won, because as we know, the UFC is a multi-billion dollar company. Probably, I think the last evaluation had them at $12 billion. So if they're worth $12 billion, and just doing simple math, and they paid out $335 million, they paid out just a little corner a little piece of the type of money that they can generate. That's the first thing. Secondly, they don't have to pay anything in the area of medical expenses, which we know as companies, especially in the United States, medical expenses for employees or non-employees is extremely costly for companies. So that's a major part of it. So, and then also they didn't have to do anything in the area of contracts. They don't have to change contracts to help the fighters. So the fighters lost majorly. But what was important in the settlement that I don't think the fighters were looking at was how it was going to affect the fighters coming after them. So the people that were a part of it, the faces of it, like the Kung Lees and people like that, they're not in the UFC anymore. And so they are in an area where they can't generate that type of money, that type of income. So anything that comes to them, of course, they're going to be happy, and of course, they're going to take it. But I think that the why of the lawsuit was lost when the settlement was presented. And so I talked today, I had an interview with Jillian Robertson, and I asked her before, I didn't ask her on the interview, I asked her beforehand, hey, I wanted to bring this up, but I wanted to make sure that she was okay with bringing it up. And she said she didn't know much about it at all. And that right there told me they weren't doing it for the current fighters. They had nothing to do with them. It was all about them getting the most money that they could get. And that's what they did. And so clearly the fighters lost, the UFC won. And I mean, it's case closed. They're not going to do anything unless the fighters get together, which they clearly are not going to. I don't even know how much we should care about this anymore if they're not going to do anything about it.
Yeah, it's a fair point. What do you think about it, CJ?
I totally agree with everything that he just said, and it does feel really bad to think that way. If you don't care about your money, why should I? I don't know if I necessarily share that, I guess, sentiment for that. You just never really know why somebody folds that way, like in that situation. But they definitely folded, and I do think the UFC won majorly.
Folded like a lawn chair.
Yeah. No, I think what you've both said has kind of echoed a lot of what my thoughts are on it. My view is that like this is a relative disaster for one group in particular, because obviously like $330 million sounds like a hell of a lot of money, and it's a lot of money, you know, for the former fighters that were part of this lawsuit. It certainly will be a nice payout for them. It's kind of important, firstly, to note from a financial perspective that if the UFC had lost this lawsuit, they were reportedly in line to pay out, I think it was in excess of $3 billion, which could have been the death toll for the entire company. Because people aren't aware of this about how antitrust lawsuits work. So while the initial amount I think it was massive. I think it was believed to be about $900 million had the fighters been successful. But in a class action lawsuit, the UFC would have been required to pay triple that amount, as lawsuits of this nature are kind of designed to not only severely punish the perpetrator, but to basically warn anybody else from attempting to conduct like the same practices in the first place. So it's essentially just showing not just the UFC, but other organizations, don't pull this shit again, or we will fuck you. Like, this is not cool. Don't do it. So while $330 million is a lot of money, or seems to be, as you alluded to, it's a drop in the ocean compared to what the UFC would have been expected to pay had they lost. And the thing is, that is a big if. So this is a massive win for them, just from a financial perspective. Now, for the former fighters themselves, this is a win of sorts as well. They're all going to receive potentially life-changing sums of money and bring close to a matter that would have likely taken in the region of maybe 10 years to conclude. And it wouldn't have been guaranteed to end in a payout if they'd lost, and they could have lost. So from that perspective, while I understand that many will feel that the former fighters have kind of fucked over the current roster, the current generation of fighters, I can understand why the fighters involved in the lawsuit were willing to settle on those terms honestly. I might have done the same in that situation. You know, you're going to wait 10 years. You don't know if it's actually going to be effective, and you don't know if the lawyers that you're working with are going to have the means to take it that far. So it could have ended right there. I think the real issue here is that it means that we're basically guaranteed now to get no, and again, you alluded to this as well, we're going to get no contractual changes to these practices whatsoever. And in fact, even more so, it basically solidifies the UFC's position to continue doing this going forward, because they've basically made their contracts more ironclad now. So the real losers here, as you alluded to, are the current roster. They're going to be, and because basically they're being forced not just to sign just restrictive contracts that underpay them and prevent them from working for anyone else. But one big thing that came out of this is they're also signing documents that basically say that they are legally unable to file similar lawsuits in the future when they realize how utterly fucked over they've just been. And that is a massive thing. So they basically they haven't just killed this one, they've killed any of the future roster from doing the same thing. So it's a win for the UFC in this, you know, and a small win for the fighters getting a fraction of the money they feel they're owed to, up to a certain point. But it is a massive loss for the current fighters that will continue to be screwed over down the line. So, and again, as you alluded to, the only way we're going to see a change to this is two ways. If we get a fighters union, which we're not going to get, because it's a selfish sport. And the thing is, as you know, as TJ Dillashaw once famously said, the fact is, if there are always people who are going to be willing to step up and take that spot for less to get into that spotlight. And then the only other potential change is government intervention, you know, where the UFC is kind of forced to pay greater percentages by law and are prevented to improve such restrictive contracts, which is just as unlikely due to the fact that issues of this nature are meant to stamp out indiscretions against consumer or for the paying customer, which is not what's happening here. Because as CJ alluded to, the customer doesn't give a fuck. We're getting the product that we want. If the we don't care what or the majority of us don't care what the UFC fighters are getting paid. It's going to be business as usual. We're going to get that nice little tidy package, and that's how it's going to be. So, yeah, there were definitely winners and losers in this, and I think ultimately it's the talent that have lost out the most in this situation. And that's, as a purist and as somebody who cares about the sport and cares about the fighters, it's a disaster from that perspective.
Yeah, it is, man. It's really sad to see. But one thing that you mentioned was about the government intervention, and I think that there's a possibility if the UFC, if Strikeforce, I'm so used to mentioning Strikeforce, if Bellator and PFL fall apart how we think that they possibly will, then that means the UFC will have a bigger market share. And if they have a bigger market share, then that's where the possibility of them thinking that it's going to be a monopoly could come across the desk of the government, and that may be the one thing that could happen to break things up. That's the only possibility I see at this point.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, we effectively have a monopoly now, but as long as Bellator and PFL are existing within the space, and you've got several, like, obviously local competitors that at least have the opportunity to break into the stratosphere, it wouldn't be considered as a full-fledged monopoly. But the way things are headed, the deck is entirely in the UFC's card at this point. This was a massive victory for them.
Massive. For sure.
But it's definitely going to be interesting to see what it is going forward. I feel like it's disappointing for me because, as you said, this going all the way through would have given Bellator and PFL a bigger chance of competing. So we've, you know, I remember when we talked before about how we'd love to see cross-promotional stuff where we see all the best fighters fighting everybody. This has basically killed that for however long.
Yeah, that is definitely not happening.
Definitely not happening now.